So good evening and welcome to WIT, the Author Guild Foundation Words, Ideas, and Thinkers series. My name is Lynn Bolger and I am the Executive Director of the Authors Guild Foundation. As I was telling Matthew and Christina earlier, we started these conversations pre-COVID as salons and real living rooms, knee to knee, with little plates on our laps. COVID has drove us to the web, like so many other events and things, but one of the great things about this is that people are joining from all over the country. The idea is still sort of like coffee or cocktails and conversation, and we like to keep these talks rather cozy. So please do introduce yourself in the chat and say where you're joining us from, because we want this to be all together. I know many of you may be cooking dinner or folding laundry, but if you can, when the question time comes up, please turn your camera on so the speakers aren't looking at 50 black boxes when they're answering audience questions. And we encourage your questions. At around 7:45, Matthew and Christina will start the Q&A. Please raise either that little cartoon hand or your real hand, and my colleague Nikki will call on you. We find these conversations go better in speaker mode, just looking at the speakers so that you're not, you can really see and hear them. And Matthew will be sharing his screen for part of it, so that will help. So for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. This series, WIT, means to expand our understanding of critical issues and celebrate America's literary culture. We host conversations with the people at the leading edge of American letters. The Authors Guild is America's oldest and largest professional organization of writers. Since our founding in the early 1900s, we have served as the collective voice of America's authors and have long supported the rich and diverse literary culture of our country. Writing can be a fairly lonely profession, and Guild membership provides a supportive community of over 12,000 members from across the country. The Guild fights for writers. We advocate on behalf of all authors by supporting free speech, fair contracts, copyright protection, and a living wage. The Authors Guild Foundation, that's what I'm executive director of, serves as the charitable arm of the Authors Guild and was started in the 1970s by Toni Morrison, John Hersey, Saul Bellow, Madeleine L'Engle, among other literary luminaries who help support the important work of the Guild. Thanks to all that donate. This is an ongoing series. Upcoming talks include Gia Tolentino and Ronan Farrow, Sam Sifton, Andre Houston Mack and Jay McInerney, many more. Nikki will put the link in the chat. We add new talks all the time, so stay tuned. But tonight we are welcoming two brilliant writers who know each other quite well. Both were in Montclair, New Jersey, and they know each other from the larger writing world. They've done more talks like this before. Matthew Thomas is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, We Are Not Ourselves, which was named a notable book of the year by New York Times, named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post, Esquire, Entertainment Weekly, Publishers Weekly, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Apple, and others. We Are Not Ourselves has been translated into 19 languages, Matthew, is that right? Going on 19. Matthew has a BA from the University of Chicago, an MA from the Writing Seminars at Johns Hopkins University, and an MFA from the University of California, Irvine. He teaches in New York University's low-res MFA program in Paris and Xavier High School in New York City. Did I say NYU? NYU. Christina Baker Kline is a #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, A Piece of the World, Orphan Train, among others. Her works have received the New England Prize for Fiction and the Maine Literary Award, to name just two, and have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, and schools as a one book, one read selection. Christina is a graduate of Yale, Cambridge, and the University of Virginia, where she was a Henry Wines Fellow in fiction writing. She has taught at Yale, NYU, and the University of Virginia. So welcome, you two. Christina, is it right? You're kicking us off?
Yes, thank you, Lynn. I'm so delighted to be here. And also, I just want to tell you all, if you don't know it already, that the Authors Guild, of all the writers' organizations, is the most friendly and the most meaningful to emerging writers of all kinds, because they provide legal services, they help find agents, they if you need any kind of contract, if you have any kind of contract questions, if you might be a bad art friend, for example, they'll help you out. They're just great. And I have been a member for a long time. I've always been involved with the Authors Guild, and I'm just so thrilled that Lynn Bolger is now spearheading all kinds of innovative initiatives as part of the foundation. So it's delightful to see you do this, Lynn. And I want to put in a plug that Monday, May 23rd, in person, according to all of our plans, there will be a gala at the Plaza in New York. How glamorous is that? A black and white ball. So for any of you who want to travel to New York, please do. I hope to be there. I will be there. If God willing, right? With all that, we'll see. Okay, so let's move on. Matt Thomas, I'm just so incredibly delighted and honored to be doing this with you.
I am honored you asked me, Christina. Thank you.
Matt and I became friends when he moved to Montclair. God, I don't even know how long ago it was, Matt, but you were in your super white hot fame moment of having this giant book that everybody wanted to talk about. And so somehow we became fast friends. I don't remember who introduced us.
It doesn't matter.
Montclair is a wonderful town just outside of New York, filled with writers, but there are surprisingly few fiction writers. There are lots of New York Times journalists, for example. And so the fiction writers tend to band together, but Matt and I became fast friends and have done lots of events together. I asked Matt to be part of this tonight because I knew that we have incredible conversations about craft. And honestly, I wanted to share this with all of you. Matt gave a series of lectures at NYU, and one of them was on this topic of managing time, basically on the page. We'll talk about off the page as well. But he has already a bunch of sort of examples that he's going to draw from. And my role in at least the first part of this conversation is to chime in now and then. But I really want to hear from you, Matt, because I know it was one of the most successful of their lectures and people have been talking about it ever since. So I'm hopeful that we can get some wisdom from you about managing time on the page.
Well, thank you, Christina. I had prepared a document for everyone. It's a long document. I'm going to share it with everybody. There's no way that we can go through this. This is adapted from a talk I gave. I'm going to do my best to go quickly through some examples. But I'd like also to stop and focus on some of them in particular. So if we do get bogged down, that's only to the good, I think. Before I share my screen, I think what I generally want to present is the idea that writers can manage time, that they do manage time, that they have to manage time, and that in fact, the management of time is a very deliberate thing that I think allows for the greater mysteries that fiction is interested in, narrative art is interested in exploring, which are, the insoluble mysteries, the mysteries of the heart, the mysteries of the spirit. When we have room for those mysteries, for those real ambiguities, I think that's when literature really flourishes. And I think that room is created when we have enough specificity to know where we are in time. And I guess part of what I'll argue today is that a writer creates for herself the opportunity for really deep engagement, for really interesting mystery and ambiguity when we're not wondering about the facts before us. So I'll start presenting. Let me know if you can see my screen. And I just want to start by looking at some pages from Goodbye Columbus, which is, of course, Roth's first book, National Book Award winning book, published in 1959. And he was 26, I believe, when this came out. We start off right away in this very definite and specific and unambiguous place. The first time I saw Brenda, she asked me to hold her glasses. And I just marked things up with some numbers. I'm going to try to go quickly through this to get through as many as possible. But if we look at number 2, that night before dinner, I called her. We know where we are in time. It couldn't be clearer that we are talking about later that night after meeting her. And he continues in that vein. When we look at the next example here, but when I called, Brenda Potemkin wasn't home. So it's not just that he gives us a kind of time marker at the outset of a scene, it's that he's kind of reminding us throughout that time is passing in small ways. So one of the things I'm going to try to highlight today is that time management happens at the minute level and also at the macro level. And it's not just managing events as they unfold, it's also managing the past, finding a way to fit the past into the larger story, and prefiguring the future as it comes. Forgive me as my screen freezes a bit. We get a break in sections here, and it starts in a way that, maybe we might be afraid would be too straightforward if we were nervous about perhaps showing our hand too readily. The next day, I held Brenda's glasses for her once again. The next day, it's a definite moment in time. It's unambiguous. It's the very next day. And this almost becomes a tick for Roth, because if we look in the next section, section 3 begins, the next morning I found a parking space on Washington Street directly across from the library. And what I want to suggest is he doesn't feel the need to prevent us from knowing this stuff, that he doesn't see virtue in a kind of obscurity here, that what he allows for is for us to know exactly what's happening so that we can get to more interesting questions. Now, this is obviously a choice, and there's a certain kind of writing that courts that sort of obscurity. Even at the level of where are we temporally, where are we physically. Some of the higher modernist texts will engage in that level of kind of deliberate confusion. And it's not to say that you can't do anything interesting with that, but I would say, if faced with a choice, presenting the material that we are going to be learning about in the book in as straightforward a manner as possible allows for something like a deeper resonance. Christina, what do you think about this idea before I continue?
Oh, absolutely. I was just thinking, as you were showing that break, that one of the ways to show time passing, I mean, he repeated almost the same words at the beginning of the chapter, is to break into chapters, or to have white space, or to have an asterisk, like that. Those markers also help when you're trying to establish a rhythm of the way the story unfolds, the universe of the story. Roth has set this up so that we immediately know within the first 5 pages the pacing of this book. We can see time passing. He revisits the glasses. He then, the next chapter, it's the next day. It's very orderly. And to your point, that orderliness lets us relax into the story and absorb all the other stuff that's going on, because we know exactly where we are and what's happening in the scene.
And we know where we are also with relationship to the past as well. If you look, what he does with the past perfect is he allows for a framing of the past in these sort of successive frames of the past. So we have at the far end of the park beyond the museum was the bank building where I had gone to college. So there's this past tense, and then there's this past perfect, and the past perfect allows him essentially to create levels of the deeper past. I think that's something that you'll notice a lot of the time. Writers will use the past perfect in a really skillful way to suggest not just the sort of technical grammatical nature of the relationship of the elements, but a sense of the larger kind of expanse of time.
Well, and to slide in the backstory, which can be boring and hard to squeeze in. How do you do that? In this moment in time, he just has this deft hand with connecting the present to the past in such a literal way.
And he does that here with the future as well. The library was not going to be my life work. I knew it. Yet there had been some talk from Mr. Scapello, an old eunuch who had learned somehow to disguise his voice as a man's, that when I returned from my summer vacation, I would be put in charge of the reference room, a position that had been empty ever since that morning when Martha Winnie had fallen off a high stool in the encyclopedia room. Now, if you were to graph that sentence, you'd see the present moment of that sentence is actually it's ballasted by the past and the future. We've got the time in the future, the theoretical time when he would return. There's the future that he's rejecting of working in the library, and then there's the past that happened when she fell off the high stool in the encyclopedia room. And so what I'm saying is that this is almost a cubist moment here where we've got past, present, and future all mixing in this wonderful admixture. It's amazing how much can be done in one sentence to suggest the depth of the past and the future simultaneously.
And I think it's also interesting because, as you can see here, Roth doesn't shy away from having lots of information in one sentence. I mean, I think people are afraid of doing that, but there's a way in which the rhythm of his sentences allows that kind of detail to be cumulative as you go through, and you're in it, you're absorbing it. It is this feeling of being sort of buffeted along on this journey where you're getting bits, the way we do with our own memories, where bits of pieces of the past come in and out.
I think I want to skip now to Brokeback Mountain, which is a wonderful, obviously it's a terrific story, but it's specifically a wonderful lesson in understanding how to manipulate time, how to manage time. This is, of course, the great story by Annie Proulx. That begins, they were raised on small, poor ranches in opposite corners of the state. Now, what I want to suggest here is that she is absolutely willing to give us all kinds of information right from the start, without any hesitation, without any embarrassment. Ennis applied at age 14 for a hardship license that led him to make the hour-long trip from the ranch to the high school. Okay, in just the next paragraph begins, in 1963, when he met Jack Twist, Ennis was engaged to Alma Beers. I want to highlight how, in a way, audacious it is to just say, here are all my facts.
Okay, wait, Matt. So explain what you mean by embarrassment. Because there are a lot of writers who wouldn't, right, feel embarrassed about it. You're talking about a kind of idea that that literary writing is enigmatic, right? In some ways.
I think there might be the presumption in some approaches to art that art lies in the direction of
obfuscation.
Obfuscation, yeah. I think art lies in the direction of ambiguity. Art lies in the direction of skillful manipulation of language. I don't think art has to lie in the direction of a willful withholding of information. I think that is a kind of superficial level of complexity that I think is ultimately far outstripped by the greater and deeper complexities of these kind of insoluble human questions.
So when you talk to MFA students, part of your point is don't be purposely obscure for no reason.
Yeah. In fact, instead be profound.
Right.
Explore depths, find the deepest possible meanings. The fact that it's in 1963 should maybe perhaps not be a question, I guess is what I'm saying, right? And Prue understands this. I mean, she does throughout this whole story. You just get everything you need to learn. Every time you need to learn it, you learn it. You don't learn it before you need to learn it. You learn it when you need to learn it. And part of it is you don't have to say everything up front, but you eventually do have to say everything. Some things don't need to be said, and the things that don't need to be said also don't need to be said also. But okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I won't stop you on that. Go ahead, because we have a lot. I'll come back to it.
What we have throughout this story are just kind of reminders constantly of levels of time, right? So habitual actions, and then specific actions, specific scenes, and then sort of general conditions, right? The sheep trucks and horse trailers unloaded at the trailhead, and a bandy-legged Basque showed Ennis how to pack the mules. This is a specific scene, right? They got the big tent up on the Forest Service platform. These are all things that happen. During the day, Ennis looked across a great gulf and sometimes saw Jack. Now, what we get with that is the introduction of the habitual, of the notion of perhaps a larger moment in time that looks almost like scene, but is now bleeding into something, I would say, more general, not exactly a moment in time. And then immediately, as you notice, the next thing we get after the break is a specific scene. And so I think Prue understands she can't stay in that space for terribly long. She goes right into scene. Jack came lagging in late one afternoon. So we're in one afternoon.
And again, to me, that's a great example of white space, that you give yourself that sheet a little bit to enable to move on to another time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I would say white space, the management of white space is probably the thing that allows for the passage of time the most. I think your earlier point was absolutely terrific. I will try to highlight some more examples of that later. But look at this example here. The summer went on and they moved the herd to new pasture. There's an amazing amount of time that passes there. If you think about what can happen in a really minute focus in a given paragraph or a pair of paragraphs where we focus on an individual moment in time, what happens there is she just says, we're going to move on. The summer went on and they moved the herd to a new pasture. The moving of the herd is a number of small actions. She's not itemizing them. She's giving us this amount of time. And I'm going to show you some examples later of how writers will really audaciously just move time forward a matter of years at a time. You know, and we don't have to be so dutiful as to chronicle every single moment on a timeline.
So Matt, quick question.
Yeah.
We're talking about short stories here. And one of the viewers pointed out, you know, that it must be quite a different process when you're writing a novel, obviously. How do you take these examples from short fiction, which of course is compressed, and, you know, apply them to the larger work?
I would like to, hold on, I have to find a way to move the screen so I can see it better, but I want to look at Sula because I think Sula is a really good example of how this can be done. Can you still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So I think it's the same principles. I think in the short and the long form, I think perhaps it's just there's a larger canvas and there has to be acknowledgement of you know, perhaps the necessary scale going in. But I think maybe at the beginning of a novel, we get more rhetorical opportunities that we don't get in a short story because we know that there's more time in a way to burn, I suppose. So we do have a slightly more languorous opportunity at the beginning of a novel. But here, look at the beginning of Sula. In that place where they tore the nightshade and blackberry patches from their roots to make room for the Medallion City golf course, there was once a neighborhood. So we have this sort of, it's almost the lyrical.
Elegiac.
Yeah, elegiac, almost fable-like voice at the beginning of this. It stood in the hills above the valley town of Medallion and spread all the way to the river. It is called the suburbs now. So we get this wonderful interplay between past and present. It is called the suburbs now, but when Black people lived there, it was called the bottom. One road, shaded by beeches, oaks, maples, and chestnuts, connected it to the valley. The beeches are gone now, and so are the pear trees, past, present, alternating between them. So that there is, I think what that's doing is not just sort of, lockstep alternation, but rather a suggestion of the expanse of time. That by going between the past and the present like that, she's suggesting the depth of her canvas, the breadth of the canvas.
This is such a great point. And I think if you copy the structure of this paragraph, you're setting yourself up for a really large canvas.
Yeah.
Because you've got the same place, past and present coming back and forth. And it's a masterful way of showing time. I love it. I want to try it myself.
And look what she's doing here. Generous funds have been allotted to level the stripped and faded buildings that clutter the road from Medallion up to the golf course. This suggests not just the fact that there's a present moment and that we're in it, but that the present moment is inhabited by people who have agendas for the community that's being discussed here. Not just a sense of a larger scale in time, but the larger world in which this town is a part, and the agendas that may not necessarily be welcome in this community. They are going to raise the time and a half pool hall. This is actually the future, right, in the progressive form.
Right.
And here we've got a steel ball will knock to dust Irene's Palace of Cosmetology. I think right here, what we have, as you can all see, is past, present, and future in one paragraph. It's one of the wonderful things about narrative art, fiction in particular, although poetry does this as well. We can have a kind of cubist landscape We can have all moments in time. It's possible with fiction to always suggest all points in time and to do it without a lot of effort. I mean, this is obviously very skillfully wrought, but we don't need pages and pages to do that.
Can I just say one more thing about this paragraph? I mean, the masterful thing here about the future is that it's not vague. It's incredibly specific. A steel ball will knock to dust Irene's Palace of Cosmetology. You've got these details that it is absolutely going to happen, which gives the narrator such authority and sort of purpose and a firm sort of terra firma. There you are standing there. You've got control of past, present, and future.
And as we all know about Morrison, she's always in control. There's always the feeling that she is driving with a firm hand on the wheel, and has that ability to be kind of authorially magnificent, I suppose, if you want to call it that. There's a sense that whether she's a presence, characterized presence in the story or not, you always feel the notion of her presence in the work. There will be nothing left of the bottom, more of the same.
It's chilling.
It is, yeah. And okay, so what we have on the next page is this wonderful way that she invokes the conditional, which of course, when you're writing fiction and you're a developing writer, you're really meant to avoid woods, right? Things that habitually happen, because of course we prefer scene, but writing that doesn't engage a little bit of this, that doesn't suggest a sense of kind of repetitive behavior, misses a little bit of the way in which life has this sort of repetition about it, right? But here we have, if a valley man happened to have business up in those hills, he might see a dark woman. So we go from, the past and the present and the future at the beginning of this book into the theorized, speculated about possible meeting between this businessman and these people, right? The black people watching her would laugh and rub their knees. None of this has actually happened in a moment in time. None of this is in scene. It's all in a kind of imagined would-be scene. And there's a little transitional paragraph here, a shocking knee-slapping, wet-eyed laughter that could even describe and explain how they came to be where they were. Now, I'm going to skip these lines because I don't want to utter them, but that was the way it got started. This is it, a definite moment in the past.
Mm-hmm.
There's a definite
and it's ominous.
Absolutely, yes.
It's building. You can feel it, that unease coming in. You can feel it all through the previous paragraph, and you get to this, and you sit up straight, and you just have chills.
And what happens after that is we are in scene for the rest of what follows here.
Mm-hmm.
A good white farmer promised freedom and a piece of bottom land to his slave if he would perform some very difficult chores. All of this is in scene. So what I want to highlight is just the transition between the general embrace of the existence of this neighborhood on the part of the novel, the movement into a kind of imagined scene that's not really a scene, and then the beginning of a scene, and then she just stays in scene.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, a scene that's a kind of fable as well, and nothing in a way like the presence that we get in scene later, let's say at the start of chapter 2, to come here. But we really are in scene all the way until the end.
Mm-hmm.
What we get at the start of the next chapter, first of all, Morrison, to my point about telling us where we are, this entire book is constructed where the titles of each of the chapters are the years that the chapters take place in. In fact, there are no chapters 2, 3, 4. It's all 1920, 1921. She does it throughout the book. Mm-hmm. We get the past perfect right up front. The red shutters had haunted both Helene Sabat and her grandmother for 16 years. Now, the pronunciation of her name, if you know this novel, is an issue because she doesn't get called what she wants to get called. So I'm botching it, unfortunately. It's Hélène, I think. The point I want to make here is Morrison uses this word so. Mm-hmm. It advances the plot. So when Wiley Wright came to visit his great aunt Cecile in New Orleans, his enchantment with the pretty Hélène became a marriage proposal. This so, we're going to come back to the so. I just want to drop a pin there, and just let me return to it in a second. But let me just point to this line here. This is the man, of course, that she winds up with. His long absences were quite bearable for Hélène Wright, especially when, after some 9 years of marriage, her daughter was born. Two things. Number one, there's this wonderful feminist argument that's being made in this line, at the end of this paragraph, where she's being treated like a bride first and foremost, but she sees herself as a subjectivity, and in fact is quite happy not to have him around. Number one. But look how much time passes here. It's a ton of time that passes. his absences were bearable for Hélène, especially when after some 9 years of marriage, her daughter was born. 9 years of life together, dispensed with in not a sentence, but a clause. I find that amazing. What do you think, Christina?
I love it. I was thinking about that idea of just being bold with time in that way, that you just say, okay, 9 years are passing, I'm putting it in, we're moving on. And the idea of compressing and then, spreading out time and how you do that and when you do it, I think you can get into a mindset where you set rules for yourself for your book, whatever you're working on, your short story or your novel, where you feel that you have to follow certain rules about the way time unfolds. And then I feel such liberty in breaking them. So studying books like this, the way you're describing right now, is what you and I always do as writers, right? To see how other people have done it, how other people get away with it, what the sleight of hand is, the magic that enables you to drop 9 years in one sentence. I love it.
I just find it miraculous. And what I love about it is that, I mean, we see that she's so careful about her scene work, right? When she decides to drop into scene, she couldn't be more patient. And so when she says, after 9 years of marriage, we don't feel like it's carelessness. What we feel is that she is sort of arrogating to herself the right to say, hey, 9 years have passed. Go with me. This is where I want you to be in the story. Just have faith.
Exactly. And the other thing she's doing is establishing what's important and what isn't. And so you come to trust the writer when she dispenses with 9 years and then, suddenly is in the next scene and has this lovely unfolding. You're like, okay, this is worth paying attention to because she's already shown us what isn't worth paying attention to. And that's part of the dark and light of writing that I love and that we all pay attention to as we read, of course.
Well, and you see, not just in the passage of time, but actually in the shaping of a life, she's willing to say, I'm not only going to leave out an itemization of the events of that time, I'm also going to describe in a kind of thumbnail sketch a person in a period of time, right? So the body passing through as a time machine, passing through time. Under Hélène's hand, the girl became obedient and polite. Now, this is something that I think a developing writer might have a hard time confidently writing because it feels like so much telling, right? And there has to be room for some of this telling. Of course, it has to be in the most delightful mixture of scene and this kind of overarching exposition. But we need sometimes moments like this. The girl became obedient and polite. If it were to itemize each of those ways in which she did, I think it would get bogged down. What do you think?
I think that the scenes are so much showing that she has set up a situation, set up a story where the telling them becomes really important. It's our signposts. And I think in MFA programs, a lot of times, and in writing classes of all kinds, we're always told to show, not tell. But when you see a real artist tell, you understand. This is why reading is so important, right? Because we just are constantly learning. I'm in a writer's reading group, and I think there are a few of them here tonight, but what we're always doing is excavating. We're always looking at how, right now we're reading Anna Karenina, which is propping up my laptop. And we're looking at how time passes, how Tolstoy tells and when he shows, and that kind of close attention, what you're doing exactly now, I need to shut up so you can continue, I think is incredibly important. And I hope that people will look at what you've done on the page here and go home and do that themselves. I mark up all my books and I feel no guilt about it whatsoever. I think this is what you want to do if you're trying to write books.
Well, I think the interplay between the two is so important. I think the reason that telling works is because it's undergirded by really scrupulous scene work, right? And because she's so scrupulous about her scenes, when she's in them, she can get away with a sentence like this: all in all, her life was a satisfactory one. Now, if the whole book were written in that key, I think we would object. But we need this kind of thing every now and then to interpolate a kind of authorial, sort of Olympian perspective on everything. It doesn't have to be a characterized narrator, but there has to be a feeling that the author knows a lot, right? And in this case, this author can see all. All in all, her life was a satisfactory one. Just
Oh, Matt, there's an interesting question. Someone asks, it's
yeah.
interesting that a decade can pass within a chapter called 1920.
Oh, how interesting. What a great thing to observe. Yeah. I don't even know what to say about that. I think that's a brilliant observation. I mean, talk about cubism. That's it right there, right? So yes, thank you. Wonderful point.
And to your point about looseness, right? About cubism, but also about sort of, past, present, and future all being bound up together. She set the stage for that to happen. And here it is happening.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And here, let's look at that so that I directed your attention to earlier. We get another one here. And I think what you will notice if you take careful look is that writers are really willing to move things forward with words like so or and or the next day or that summer. So it was with extremely mixed emotions that she read a letter from Mr. Henri Martin. This so is doing so much work. If you think about it, that little two-letter word is essentially saying, okay, wherever we were in the previous paragraph, I'm just taking us to the next place, right? And Morrison, in her choreography, is just deciding to say, hey, go with me. You're on the next moment now. It was with extremely mixed emotions that she read a letter. And in the next paragraph, we have, it was November 1920. I mean, wonderfully, she calls the chapter 1920, but she even tells us again here, November 1920. And I think there is something about that to me says that she knows that it doesn't matter that she's told us this stuff, that her art has not in any way suffered for the explication. Any thoughts on that, Christina?
Yeah, I was just thinking she's also, we know the chapter is called 1920, so it's November, we're at the end of the year. Mm-hmm. We know that, she's going to be wrapping it up, that this is where we're learning something that comes right at the end. Mm-hmm. And also repeating the word November. She's allowing room for style, even in these mm-hmm. moments of explication mm-hmm. and exposition. So you feel the rhythm of her writing through all of it, through the scene setting and also through these moments where she's just simply telling you where you are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And where we are at the end of this chapter, or what the rest of the chapter is a specific place and time. And the scene work just gets to be extraordinary here. The day they were ready, Hélène cooked a smoked ham, left a note for her lake-bound husband in case he docked early, and walked head high and arms stiff with luggage ahead of her daughter to the train depot. Now, one of the things that we don't have time to get into, but part of why this chapter is so incredibly just powerful is that this Hélène, who in her community is such a force, such a vigorous, powerful force, sees herself as a sort of moral arbiter, understands that people listen to her. She is thrown into a situation in the rest of the scene where she's really dehumanized and really reduced by a very racist train conductor and a lot of people who don't come to her aid, including the black soldiers home from World War I, where they presumably fought to great distinction in defense of the country that they're now returning to, that is allowing a black woman to be disgraced on a train. It's a really powerful section of a really wonderful book. I hope you all read it if you haven't read it. But just look at how these definite moments in time unfold here. As they opened the door marked colored only, they saw a white conductor coming toward them. Mm-hmm. Hélène looked up at him. Look at how specific and scenic this is. Remember, we just had a lot of work before this that wasn't necessarily in the key of scene, right? And here we have just pure scene. And what that scene allows to happen is for interiority to come to the fore. And that rich interiority is the purview of fiction. That is the thing that I think separates narrative art from other art forms. We don't get to know exactly what someone's thinking in a figurative painting. We can surmise what they're thinking, but one of the reasons Mona Lisa is such a powerful image so many hundreds of years later is that we're not entirely sure what she's thinking. We can speculate about visual art forever, but with fiction, we have direct access to interiority. And I think it's at our peril as writers that we, leave aside the thing that probably is the greatest distinction in the art form. And where we get the opportunity for that is with this great scene work, right? As specific as it is, the conductor let his eyes travel over the pale yellow woman and then stuck his little finger into his ear, jiggling it free of wax. We've got this sense of touch, right? We've got something so granular. It's such wonderful writing. Hélène looked up at him, and then we get interiority, right? The interiority is set up by the scene work. Any thoughts on that, Christina?
Yeah, well, I was just actually thinking of Tarantino with this scene because the tension of that, the mundane action of putting his finger in his ear, the way it's slowed down here, we can feel the menace of it. You know, his dialogue, which is incredibly familiar in the way that Tarantino does as well, you know, creating menace in this scene. And so soon, again, repetition. And in this case, we understand that it's her sort of trying to grasp exactly what's happening here, and the realization that things are turning in this way. And we feel that, we're feeling every moment of it with her.
And Morrison goes into what I guess is technically free indirect discourse. You know, it's a
Mhm.
kind of
Yeah.
interior monologue. And I think one of the things that's great about that is that she doesn't signal that she's doing that it so expertly shifts into that. I really think that the reason this works so powerfully here is because the preceding line is Helene looked up at him.
Of course, yeah, it provides that bridge. And
Yeah.
this is a great example of how to wedge interiority into a scene. You've got a physical action, you've got the primary character, and you can then just use that, again, sleight of hand to get straight into the head of that person.
I want to be mindful of time. I know there are a lot of agendas today, and we have to cover a lot of
I
different
think we have like 5 minutes left, Matt.
Okay, all right.
Before there are questions. I mean, you know,
we
could be talking for maybe 5 hours.
oh yeah, oh definitely. All right, let me just, you know what I'll do? I'll just let's just look at this moment in Sula. I have 94 pages here. I'm sorry, everyone. We don't have time to get through
I told you that we wouldn't. I know, but honestly, this is the microcosm speaks to the whole, right? I mean, this is just
I hope so.
Brilliant work that it's worth slowing down on.
Let's look at the top of page 23 here. 2 days in 3 lines, and then this radical slowdown. If you want to, in short, if you want to know how to manipulate time, just read this sentence actually. For 2 days they rode, 2 days of watching sleet turn to rain, turn to purple sunsets, and one night nodded on the wooden seats, their heads on folded cots, trying not to hear the snoring soldiers. When they changed trains in Birmingham for the last leg of the trip, they discovered what luxury they had been in through Kentucky and Tennessee. And then we get into scene here. Now, what's wonderful to me about this is for 2 days they rode. Now, we know, I mean, look, Ulysses takes place in the course of 24 hours, right? We know how much can fit into a day. What she's saying is there was a lot in those 2 days. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of violence in reducing it to a phrase, but there's also this elegant concision, right? For 2 days they rode. Now, in those 2 days, people are thinking a lot of things. Entire psychic lives are lived during that time. You know, emotional journeys are gone through. And Morrison knows that she can't get into all that. And maybe that's a whole other novel, right? As I said, Ulysses is a whole day. 2 days of watching sleet turn to rain, turn to purple sunsets, and one night nodded on the wooden seats, trying not to hear the snoring soldiers. Mm-hmm. Then we get into the scene. And if you were to read this page, you'd see it's all just this wonderful, very specific scene work. To me, that transition right there, I think that in a way stands in for a lot of what else I would say in the rest of this talk. What do you think about that, the top of that page?
What I love about this too is that the example, what it comes to is a universal feeling that every human has felt, which is that you need to go pee and you are not in a place where you can do it. And that discomfort is this moment that it sets up the tension in this scene. It ratchets it all up. It's a very specific, very granular point. It's a universal point. It's not about race here. It's about humans, except that she's being held down because of her race. So everyone who reads this scene is going to relate to what she's going through. And I think it just creates this incredible way of zeroing in on what's terrible about this situation, that everyone can understand and feel viscerally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's 7:45. I know that we have a lot of different things to do. So let me just take our attention to that time. Do we want to transition?
Yeah, Matt. So
I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, I know we have to, I guess, just get back to us. I would ask, so my question for you is, given all of this, how do you, in your novel, how did you take these kinds of things you knew and had learned? Do you have an example from your own work of a way that you use time?
I do, yeah. I think, well, let me just say, I covered a lot of time in my novel. My first book really starts in, she's born in 1941, but the action begins in 1951 and it goes through 2011. So it's 60 years of her life. And I had to decide how to do that. And ultimately I had to decide to move time forward quite a bit in places. And one of the books that really helped me do that was Mrs. Bridge, which we didn't get to look at, but
Yeah.
Evan S. Connell in that book has just unbelievably audacious ways of moving time forward. He just moves, within one page, you get the birth of 3 children and 3 years, and then another 3 years and another 3 years. And I didn't necessarily do that at any individual moment. I tried to incorporate the notion of that into the larger structure of my book, wherein I didn't narrate every single moment in time. Like I left out the Kennedy assassination. One of the reasons I decided to do that was because I thought it would be kind of piquant to leave that out of a book about Irish Americans in New York. And I wanted to create a sense that, there is a larger social context in which all these events are operating, but the domestic drama is actually reflective in a way of the larger reality of that. And my hope was, to find those specific moments in a life that could stand in for the rest.
Yeah.
So let me just find, I have a,
You want to look for it for 1 second and I'll say one thing?
I've got it right here. Yeah, hold on.
Okay.
Let me just get back to the, sorry about this. I am so sorry. Where did my thing go? Okay, Christina, you take us for a second here.
I was just going to say, in my writer's reading group, hello, I think Bonnie and Alex are here. We were laughing about the fact that we read a whole bunch of Edith Wharton, a whole lot of Edith Wharton, which are society novels. They're about New York City. They're about relationships between people. They're about women. And she often just doesn't write the wedding. She just moves on. She's not interested. They get engaged. She, sets it all up. And the next thing you know, they're married. And it's, months later. And we were just marveling at how she does that. And I would say one of the things that I've learned from this close attention to literature in this group is about the scenes that you feel have to be the big scenes don't have to be the big scenes. Break the rules. Yeah.
You just basically made the point for me. Thank you, Christina. I don't even need to know. Which is, we don't need to narrate everything. And in fact, the things you narrate may not be the most, let's say, melodramatic.
Or expected, the expected things. The funeral, right? The funeral, the wedding.
Yes. I'm going to share just this one page here. One of the ways I tried to get a little bit, we have the negative space that you're talking about of that section break. And then I suggest the life in the neighborhood before Eileen comes around. This is in the early going in the book. By the time she was born in November of 41, some traces remained of the sylvan scene suggested in her neighborhood's name. This is Woodside, but the balance of Woodside's verdancy belonged to the cemeteries that bordered it. I give you, I think, a kind of generalized, of course, expository kind of summarizing amount of information about her family. And, that includes nights her father attended bar. This is a general condition, not an individual night, but what tends to happen. And of course, we can't go too long in that key, I think. You have to eventually move into scene. And, in the early going in my book, I'm trying to get a lot across to the reader about this young woman's whole life. It's very hard to do when you don't do some of what I'm calling summarizing, or this kind of impulse to speak in the general and in the habitual. But we have a lot of sometimes. Eileen could hear the Grady's or the Longs fighting, but of course you move into once over dinner. This is to me the interplay between this kind of thing and this kind of thing is so hugely necessary. I don't think you can get away with a book being all of this. I don't think it would appeal to our sense of classical shape. But I think without some of that, if it's all a concatenation of scene, we're looking for the larger shaping gesture.
Yeah, that word once is so great. as a transitional word into scene once or one afternoon, just bringing it straight into the singularity of it.
And then what follows this is a scene, right? An individual scene, sort of what I was saying before. When we get the general, when we get the idea of what typically happens, when we get the habitual, we can then follow it with the individually observed scene, and hopefully
white space there. You've got the white space, and then you're suddenly in the scene.
So I'm going to stop sharing. So that's the thing that occurred to me when you asked that earlier of me. Christina, what about you? I know that my goodness, so many of your books do deal with so much time. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Well, let me just say, I'm not sharing a page. I'm just going to say a couple of quick things that I've learned over the years. One is that I often have a more ambitious time frame for my story than ends up being. For example, The Exiles was really in my head unfolding over 20 years. I did research over 20 years, and it ended up being only 4 years in the actual novel. And part of it is because I got into the granular details and I realized I wanted to dwell there. And so I compressed a few things, I left out some other things. But I would say that to any of you working on a novel, a novel is a big undertaking. It's a marathon, and you may set out with really ambitious ideas about how much time passes. And sometimes it does, but in my case, I've found sometimes it's useful just to narrow. Another thing I would say that's a tip is useful is so my novel, A Piece of the World, which is about Andrew Wyeth and his relationship with the subject of his best known painting, Christina's World, is a really complex story, partly because so much of it is based on fact. I did a ton of research. I had a timeline pieced together that was sort of a 50-page single-spaced document with conflicting events and all kinds of stuff from all these different sources. And the only way I realized that I could really write the book was to write it chronologically, because I needed to get a handle on the lives of these characters. And so I wrote the whole book chronologically. And then with my editor, actually, we sat down together, we looked at the manuscript, and she said, what is the most important moment? And the most important moment in that book is when Christina meets Andrew Wyeth, and then when she sees the painting at the end. And so I was able to then weave the story back and forth, and that required a whole lot of stuff. But having that chronological layout kept my head from exploding instead of trying to write that part first and then, sort of work my way through.
But when you make the decision to make it a shorter amount of time than you had initially decided, is there a feeling of relief? Is it a feeling of frustration? What do you end up feeling in that moment?
I make choices that mean I can't do some of the things I wanted to do, but there's a certain point in writing a novel for me that it feels like a giant baggy monster and I can't control it. It's like I've invented Frankenstein and he's doing things I don't want him to do, and he's sort of lurching around and off on the heath and the ice flow. So in a way, that tunneling back into a very sort of rigid time frame is a relief, can be a relief for me. Yeah. Okay, I think we have not much time for questions.
Oh, I mean, I could listen to you guys for hours. You have me questioning my own master's program. Like, do I actually want an MFA now? Now I'm wondering what I'm doing with my life. But I do want to make sure we at least get to these 2 questions that I do see in the chat right now. I definitely want to encourage anybody, if they would like to actually say their question out loud instead of me reading it for them. So Arnie, would you actually like to ask your question on Tarantino? I'll read it out loud if that's easier for you.
Oh, I got it. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, okay, let me read it. Speaking of Tarantino, what do you think of work that plays around with time as collage, so we can ultimately see the whole story? Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs being obvious examples.
Christina,
you were talking about that a bit.
Yeah, I think it can be extraordinarily persuasive, powerful, moving, all of the things that this kind of linear narrative that I was taking you through can do. I think the key thing is that with Tarantino in particular, you always have the time signatures indicated at some point, right? All of those kinds of bricolage or a kind of a pastiche technique narratives will always eventually reveal the facts of the story. They may just not be in the right order, but I think the same techniques really apply. They just are in a way, transposed, I would say, Arnie. If you were to ask me what I think they're doing some very similar work.
It's just that the interior logic has to be absolutely steadfast. It has to be so strong when you're creating a narrative like that. You've got to have, in your own head, you've got to be really clear on how the story unfolds so that you can take those chances and make those choices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Frederick, I just noticed you said perhaps the decade was prior to 1920. That's what I was thinking when that question was when the comment was made. I think it was, of course, the 10 years in the run up to 1920, which is just a wonderful creation of a larger space, right? Yeah, go ahead, Nikki, or.
Yeah, I see Robin had a question in the chat if she'd like to speak, and then Erica, you're next.
Sure, this is such a great talk. Thank you guys so much. My question was, any craft advice on scene versus summary, especially in the very first part of the book? My inciting incident is like 10 months before my MC the main character takes the first big action. Thank you very much.
I've never heard MC. I'm going to use that myself now.
Are you serious? Okay.
I haven't been in an MFA program in many years, so I don't know. Matt, you want to start?
No, I want to hear from you on this. I actually want to hear what you have to say here, Christina. So what do you think?
I am not sure what I have to say. It feels like I felt like I would probably need to read it to see what I think of that, because I think you can get away with anything. I remember my writing teacher, George Garrett, who was sort of a writer's writer, not well known in the wider world, but a wonderful writer that writers admired, talking about how you can get away with anything if you do it in the first 3 pages. In other words, you're setting up the world of your story, and as long as you set that up at the beginning, you can do it throughout the book. And I thought that was interesting.
I think a lot of novels begin with I suppose summary, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Or in my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. There's that opening. And then there's, the opening of Buddenbrooks, which is a line of dialogue, or, the opening of a lot of Hemingway stories, which is in the middle of scene. He doesn't tell you anything about where you are. I think you can do anything you want. The only rule is that it has to work.
Yeah. And is our next talk going to be on how to make it work? Maybe we don't know really, but.
Erica, I think you were next.
Yes, thank you. So what's the one thing that you know now that you wish about manipulating time on the page or managing time on the page that you wish that you knew when you first started writing?
Wow. I wish I knew early on how much power a writer has to decide how much time we're dealing with at a given moment or in the course of the work. I think when I was writing the finger exercise stories that I was learning by writing that were really not any good in their own, I wasn't really aware that I had as much power as I have later, that we all do. We can just decide how much time the story takes place in and decide what to leave out. It's really up to you. And your authority is the most precious resource. The authority and you essentially the reader's faith in you. As long as you create that reader's faith, you can do anything you want.
Definitely. I'll just add, this is a general point, but also quite specific to this question, which is I used to write slowly, meticulously, and carefully. And now I'm much messier. My drafts are ugly, my first drafts. And I do think there's a coolness factor, at least in my own experience, having both been in an MFA program and taught in MFA programs, to how you want to sort of tell stories, often in a sort of esoteric way. I think that if you give yourself the freedom in that first draft to be explicit about time in the way that Matt has shown you examples, knowing that you can take it out. That's going to help you. In other words, what I do in my first drafts is give myself signposts, some of which stay in and some of which come out, but so that I know exactly what time it's happening, when it's happening, how it's happening. And I just trust that I can edit the manuscript. And I think when I started, I didn't trust that I could edit my own work. And I know, having done it a lot, I know that I can. So I now give myself a lot of freedom to set those markers in, and some of them will stay and some of them will go, depending on how obscure or ambiguous, as Matt said, you want to be in certain sections. Just put it all in. That great line, if you don't put it in, you can't take it out. So I live by that.
I love that. I want that to be the last line uttered here. If you put it in, you can't take it out. That's great.
The last line is going to be me saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys were awesome. There is no power like the power of rapport. We could listen to you guys talk all day long. It was so great. Maybe we should have a series so that we can all have our COVID MFAs. I also just wanted to say that the next talk that we're going to have is with Sam Sifton, who is a managing editor of the New York Times, but most beloved, the food editor. And we're going to be talking about cooking, writing, and breaking with tradition on Thanksgiving. And that is coming up, I think it's Monday, the 6th or the 8th of November. And then Jay McInerney and Andre Houston Mack are going to be talking about wine and wine writing in December. So lots more to come. Again, thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.